Shri Gurubhyo Namaha, Shri Paramagurubhyo Namaha, Srimad Ananda Tirtha Bhagavatpadacharyebhyo Namaha. Hari Om. Yonta Pravishya Mamamacha Mimam Prasuptam Sanjeevayat Takila Shakti Dharas Swadhamnam Anyam Cha Hatya Charana Shravana Twagadin Pranan Namo Bhagavate Purushaya Tubhyam Vyasaya Bhavanashaya Shrishaya Gunarashaye Hrudyaya Shuddha Vidyaya Madhvaya Cha Namo Namaha. Arthakalpita Kalpoyam Pratyartha Gadakesari Vyasatirtha Gurur Bhuya Tasmadishtartha Siddhaye. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Namaskaras to one and all. The present lecture is being organized by the Atharva Forum on Sarvadarshana Sangraha and about Indian philosophy in general in the context of Sarvadarshana Sangraha. Well, Indian philosophy has a rich legacy both from the literary perspective as well as from the intuitive perspective also. There is always two sides to philosophy. One is at the experience level and the other is at the presentation of it in the literary front. We find many divinations by sages who divined the eternal truths and handed over to us in the form of Vedas, the Upanishads, the Agamas, and many other scriptural texts. They are all backed by divine revelations and they have an eternal place in the context of Indian philosophy. When we come to the literary presentation of these experiences, there are many debates on how exactly the passages need to be interpreted. The scriptures are held at very high esteem because they are a matter of divine experience and the revelations of sages. There is no doubt about the validity of the scriptures. However, the debate is about how exactly the poetic expressions and the sentences which appear in the scriptures need to be interpreted. And that is the tradition of Vakyartha we find in Indian philosophy. The debates are called as Vada and also called as Vakyartha more familiarly. The name itself as Vakyartha to the general debate as such clearly signifies that the debates in the Indian context was about how exactly a sentence is to be interpreted, particularly when the validity of the scripture is unquestioned. As an aid to this, many concepts were discussed, many polemical exercises were done by many philosophers. Thus, in the context of Indian philosophy, there is no disregard for any philosopher or any school of thought at the personal level. But however, at the conceptual level, there is always a debate as to how exactly a concept has to be crystallized. No concept can be taken at the apparent level as it can be understood in all disciplines. Any discipline and any pedant of the discipline would generally agree that at the apparent level the concept looks very rudimentary, taken at the face value at all. Hence, it is prudent that a concept needs to be chiseled to its perfection. And that is exactly why concepts are being reviewed by debaters, by writers and philosophers. While reviewing these concepts, there is always a scope for the use of logic and hermeneutics, and even grammar to a certain extent. That is exactly why in many of the awarding titles called as the Birudu for the philosophers and debaters, we could see a phrase called as Padavakya Pramana Paravara Parina. It refers to a scholar who is having the in-depth knowledge in the grammar, hermeneutics, and the logic as well. Kanadam Paniniyam cha Sarvashastropakarakam is also a line which signifies the use of logic and grammar while we are debating anything. Of course, the overuse has to be shunned. There is no doubt about it. Sri Mādhavāchārya very clearly notes it. Shushka tarkam tu varjayet. One should not indulge in dry debates without any purpose or without any method. Even the Upanishad itself, the Kataka Upanishad itself mentions this. Naisha tarkena matirapaneya. Any philosophical debate concerning about the creation of the world and the creator of the world cannot go on and on by dry logic alone. Dry logic, in the sense that it is unsupported by valid experience and scriptural authority, cannot actually convey any concept of supernatural nature. It would neither prove the existence of such things nor would be able to deny it. And this is being conveyed in the Kathoponishat. Na Vedavit Manutedam Brahantam Sarvanabhum Atmanam Samparaye. These are certain mantras which appear to show that it is scriptural validity and intrinsic valid experience that actually leads to correct concepts in philosophy. Actually, dealing with Indian philosophy, it is prudent to understand that there was always a progress. It was not a static system with lot of dogmatic assumptions. Rather, it was diametrically opposite to that. Indian philosophy was never static, it was always dynamic. Philosophers were free to express their opinion and even their concepts and fine tuning them to logical precision. None of the philosophers were barred to exercise their logic and reason and to substantiate their own schools of thought. Academic freedom, or rather, what can be called as philosophical freedom, was always there in the Indian soil from time immemorial, if it's not an exaggeration. We need to understand that all schools of thought have their own arguments and their own method to substantiate their stands. However, it doesn't mean that all the stands need to be equally true. For any purpose of reconciliation and a go togetherness, a philosopher or logician should not be forced to agree that all schools of thought would actually convey the same truth. It is true that all schools of philosophy aim at conveying the truth, but however, when we critically review the schools, there is bound to be certain contradictions. Some of them may be apparent contradictions, and some of them may be real contradictions also. In that case, any student of philosophy, any inquisitive person who dives deep into philosophy, should naturally arrive at the truth by not only using logic but also using hermeneutics and grammar to some extent, and also be aided by valid experience, both intuitive as well as general experience. So, in this context, we need to look at the wide spectrum of Indian philosophy so that we can actually procure the gem of thought from various schools of Indian philosophy. Sarvadarshana Sangraha is a major text in Indian philosophy. It is, in one way, actually an intermediate text, and it is also an advanced text of Indian philosophy. It can hardly be called as a beginning text or beginner's text at all. The reason is the language as well as the presentation of various schools of thought are actually full of scholarly details and scholarly diction also. So it is not per se to a beginner, at least not to the beginner of the present times. Probably the beginners of those times when the Sarvadarshana Sangraha was written were more adept in grammar, in the diction of the Sanskrit language, particularly philosophical prose. In the present context, it is at the intermediate level, and it is also used at the advanced level also. The author of Sarvadarshana Sangraha is Mādhavāchārya, also known as Sayana Mādhavāchārya. Some scholars try to identify him with Sri Vidyaranya Muni also. I would not actually touch upon that debate as such in the present lecture. However, we need to understand that the Sarvadarshana Sangraha definitely has the background of the post medieval time of Indian philosophy. During the Vedic times and the post Vedic times, the presentation of India's Indian philosophy was quite different. When we come to the early medieval times and the prime medieval times, it was mostly a crystallization of the Nyaya school of thought, followed by Purvamamsa. It was in turn followed by the Acharya Trayas, who wrote the celebrated commentaries, bhashyas on the canonical texts such as the Brahma Sutras, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita. The language in the presentation was direct, but also in the commentarial tradition. When we come to the post medieval times, scholastic presentation of these schools of thoughts were done. In such a context, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha text appears. The author of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha actually understands that any student of Indian philosophy should actually have an overview of the entire Indian philosophy at the first instance. Without actually understanding the intricate details of Indian philosophical schools, no student of philosophy or even a scholar of Indian philosophy or even philosophy in general can actually venture into any constructive criticism or even wrangling or even debate as such, and also cannot try to crystallize any concept of his own also. He need to have a overview and a scholastic view of the major schools of Indian philosophy, or rather all schools of Indian philosophy which appeared till date in those times. This was definitely required even at that time also. Linear learning, where a person reads one particular school of thought for a couple of years and then moves on to another school of thought and again masters it for a couple of years, could only be done by several dedicated scholars and people of high intelligence and capacity. However, the author of Sarvadarshana Sangraha here feels that a nutshell has to be given to scholars as well as to the readers. While giving this presentation, the author of Sarvadarshana Sangraha is aware that a mere summary would not actually serve the purpose. Just a page long summary of the Indian schools of thought will actually not do justice to any schools of Indian thought. Hence, the author of Sarvadarshana Sangraha dedicates many pages for important schools of thought and also gives quotations from the original works of those schools. Whenever a particular school of thought is presented, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha and very sincerely presents those schools of thought without diluting their concept and debates also. Even when certain debates and criticisms of the schools of thoughts, as they would criticize other schools, were presented, it was presented quite sincerely. Even the original works were being quoted. The authoritative lines from those schools of thoughts were also quoted almost in all the sections of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha. Hence, anybody who reads the Sarvadarshana Sangraha is bound to gain a thorough knowledge of those schools of thought, not as an external reader, but also as um, a person who is actually reading the primary text also, because there are many quotations from the primary text. This is an important contribution of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha. Another important aspect that is to be understood about Sarvadarshana Sangraha is that it presents all schools of thoughts, but it does not give any detailed criticism, refutation of any school of thought in detail. The purpose of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha is to give a nutshell of those schools of thoughts quite in a comprehensive way. But however, there is no surging criticism of any schools of thought extensively. This is because the text is aimed to give a bird's eye view of the schools of thought. However, when each of the schools of thoughts is being presented and moved to the next school of thought, the author of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha gives 2 to 3 reasons as to why the earlier school was left and a new school was taken up. Of course, it is not the author who is taking up the next school of thought per se. However, what made the other school of thought to present a different point of view when there were other theories which were actually trying to explain the same context before? For example, when moving from the Charvaka darshana to Jaina darshana, then to the Bauddha darshana, then to the Ramanujiya darshana, and then to the Purvapaksha, Ramandarshana, and others. The author of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha shows why the other school actually differs from the former school. In fact, when giving this criticism, it is not a criticism or a refutation which the author of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha gives, but rather it is the refutation which appears in the later school itself. And even that refutation is given quite sincerely there. The Sarvadarshana Sangraha tries to make a progressive presentation. But of course, here the author of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha has his affiliation when presenting it. Of course, not from a subjective, prejudiced view, but rather from his own conviction. He starts from the Charvaka darshana and moves on to present all the darshanas and ends with the Advaita Vedanta darshana. It can be understood that the author of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha belongs to the tradition of Advaita Vedanta darshana and tries to present it at the end in a progressive way. However, he doesn't make any rash criticism of the other school, and he doesn't try to shun all the other schools in that way. In fact, there are many comments in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha itself where he says certain points of views has to be taken from all schools of thought. But however, it is also true that the progressive method is also adopted and implemented by the author of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha in his own understanding and with his own conviction. Well, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha has many sections or what can be called as chapters. It is written in a prose style. It begins with an invocation, no doubt, and it proceeds with the presentation of schools of thoughts in prose style. Many verses are here and there quoted from original sources also. Many mantras are being quoted, and at times a summarized version of the entire schools of thought or a particular concept is also presented in a verse form. It is typical to the treatises that we see in uh, Indian philosophy, which are called as Prakarana Granthas. Of course, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha can also be called as Sangraha Grantha, also as a Prakarana Grantha also. It is often said, Shastraikadesha Sambaddham Shastra Karyantare Sthitam Ahu Prakaranam Nama Grantha Bhedam Vipaschitaha. Scholars feel that there is a kind of text which need to be written, which is called as Prakarana. It is a treatise which is not belonging to the commentarial style, but rather it is an independent treatise which tries to present some of the concept of the Shastras and tries to achieve some of the purpose of the Shastra. The Shastra, by the word Shastra, we mean the entire Indian philosophical context. So here, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha has many major schools of thought. Charvaka Darshana, Bauddha Darshana, Jaina Darshana, Ramanuja Darshana, Purna Prajna Darshana, Nakulisha Pashupata Darshana, Shaiva Darshana, Pratyabhigna Darshana, Raseshwara Darshana, Vaisheshika Darshana, Nayyayika Darshana, Jaimini Darshana, Sankhya Darshana, Yoga Darshana, and Shankara Darshana. So this is how the entire Sarvadarshana Sangraha is being planned. At first, it begins with Charvaka Darshana. It's very important to note that even the materialistic, atheistic, heterodox school of Charvaka was not shunned by the author here as not being worth to delineate. However, here a rightful place has been given to even the materialistic school here, acknowledging it even as a school of thought. Of course, the criticism part and the refutation part is different, but at least when we consider the freedom of speech and freedom of academy and freedom of philosophical thinking, speculation as such, it is being given a place in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha, very importantly. Well, actually, there are no major primary texts that are available about the Charvaka school of thought. There are references to certain sutra literature that will be written from the Charvaka perspective with certain commentaries also, but they are not available in entirety as primary texts. So here and there, what we get about the Charvaka system is from references and summaries from various philosophers, from various texts which actually try to even refute them. But we can also understand that the Charvaka school can actually be reconstructed and rethought even by us when we take this stand of rigorous materialism, rigorous atheism, and rigorous heterodoxy. So when we think of that stand, it is the Charvaka system which actually comes to the picture. So reconstruction or thinking about the Charvaka school, even without the text, primary text, is not so difficult. The Charvaka system doesn't actually have any commentarial tradition and doesn't try to comment on any of the Upanishads or any of the canonical texts. It is not based on any scripture at all. It is more so based on a particular concept and particular approach to philosophy. So when the approach to philosophy or concept is being understood by us, reconstruction of the school of thought is not difficult, and that is what the author of Sarvadarshana Sangraha has done here. He begins with the Charvaka system. I would give a summary of the major systems of thought that is being given in Sarvadarshana Sangraha. And of course, in the future lectures, I would like to go into greater detail about it, if possible, even by interpreting the actual lines of the text and following the text with the available commentaries and research aids also. Well, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha begins with the Charvaka Darshana. It is a school of materialism. It is a school of atheism and also heterodox. What do we mean by heterodox? Well, actually, when we try to understand the Indian schools of thought, there are two ways in which it can be understood. The orthodox way of understanding the Indian school of thought is to look at the division of Indian philosophy as heterodox and orthodox. I would not call it as atheistic and theistic, because when we talk about Astika and Nastika schools of thought, particularly uh, with reference to the ancient texts or rather the medieval texts, it is actually about the division of the schools which accepted the validity of the Vedas and those who do not accept the absolute validity of the Vedas. So when any school of thought accepts the Vedic literature, the Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishads, which are in turn actually appearing in the form of Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samveda, Atharvaveda, which with auxiliary texts as valid, authentic, and unquestionable, at least at the scrutiny level. Also, at the scrutiny level, such a school of thought is termed as Astika. So it can actually be understood as the orthodox school, which accepts the Vedic and auxiliary literatures as valid and authentic about presenting any philosophical concept. When we talk about Nastika schools of thought, it is not referring to the atheistic school literally, but rather about schools of thought which do not actually agree upon the absolute, unquestionable validity of the Vedic literature and its auxiliaries. With this division, if at all we look at this division, three schools of thought appear in the heterodox list: the Charvaka school, the Bauddha school, and the Jaina school of thought. So, um, when we look at this division of the Astika and the Nastika schools of thought, those who accept the absolute or the authenticity of the Vedic thought are actually called as the Orthodox school or the Astikas. When we look at the Nastika school of thought, they do not accept the absolute authenticity of the Vedas. Of course, there is a variance about how much they question about the authenticity of the Vedic literature. In the heterodox school also, we can divide them as Devatavadins and Adevatavadins, or Ishwaravadins and Anishwaravadins. Those who are atheistic in the sense that they do not admit the creator of the universe are actually called as Anishwaravadins, and Charvaka school belongs to that particular division. The Bauddha Jaina schools to some extent seem to accept at least at a mundane level that there seems to be some power which is creating the universe. It may not be ascribing to any personal god, however, atheistic as the Charvaka school at least. So, with the division of being heterodox and also being atheistic, the Charvaka school appears first in the delineation of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha. It is also materialistic. In this school, actually, to put it in very simple terms, nothing supernatural is accepted. Everything is accepted as having the natural cause. Whatever that is being observed is accepted as real or truth. Anything that is beyond our observation is not accepted at all. Well, logic seems to be accepted in one sense, but in another sense, it is not accepted strictly. So, in this way, mere perception, or rather direct observation, alone is being entertained. So, the Charvaka school of thought, it is materialistic from the perspective that it only accepts materials or the things which actually come to direct observation. Empirical observation alone is to be regarded as proof according to the Charvakas. There is no such concepts as heaven and hell or supernatural elements playing any role either in ontology or even at the functioning level of the world also. So in this way, the Charvaka believes that we need to do well in this world, accept what is observed, and not go behind any superstitious practices. The details have been actually expounded in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha. Another important school of thought that appears in Sarvadarshana Sangraha is the Bauddha Darshana. It is the school of Buddhism. The four schools of Buddhism is being expounded here. The Sautrantika, the Vaibhashika, the Vijnanavadi, and the Madhyamika Shunyavada also is being expounded. Two important concepts, two important variations have been noted. In one of the sub-schools of Buddhism, the consciousness alone is being accepted as absolutely real. In a more rigorous and rigid school of Buddhism, or what can be called as Shunyavada, not even consciousness is accepted as absolute reality. Further, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha gives a summary that everything is held as kshanika or momentary by the classical scholarly school of Buddhism. Sarvam kshanikam kshanikam. Everything is held as momentary. Everything has fleeting existence. Nothing is actually permanent or even enduring. This is being forwarded and tried to be vindicated by the Kshanikatvawadins by advancing many arguments. And a very deep scholarly presentation of this school is being done in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha. The right passages and the right diction is also being used here, and many advanced arguments are also being portrayed here. Further, the third important school that is being expounded is the Jaina school of thought in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha. It rejects the absolute denial of the world as done by the Buddhist system. Rather, the Jaina school of thought remarks that relativism is at the core of the world. Relativism in the sense that everything is anekantika. Nothing can be ascertained as this or that and in absolute terms. Everything is relative. When we look at a tree, it appears to be big when we compare it to a small tree. But at the same time, the same tree looks very small when we compare it to a mountain. So whether a tree is big or small depends upon the perspective with which it is being understood. It depends on the referential point. So everything is relative and everything is multifaceted. And this is Syadvada or Anaikantikata Vada. Arguments have been shown here in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha that how everything has to be relative. While dealing with Jaina Darshana, another important aspect that can be noted in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha is that many ethical points that are being noted in the Jaina Darshana is also being elucidated here. So, in that way, Sarvadarshana Sangraha is not only a philosophical text but also gives a summary of the religious stand of those schools of thought. The primary concept of ahimsa or non-violence, as being portrayed by the Jaina school of thought, is being expounded in great detail here. And even when dealing with the Buddhist schools of thought, also the Arya Satyas and other ethical points are also being noted, and it's quite useful for any reader, not only from the rigorous philosophical point of view, but also from the religious and ethical point of view also. We come across the expounding of the Ramanuja school of thought in Sarvadarshana Sangraha. The Ramanuja school of thought belongs to the Vedanta school in the medieval times. It is a Vaishnava school of Vedanta propounded by Sri Ramanujacharya. It is further developed by Sri Vedanta Deshikacharya and many others. It is in one way, a school of pantheism. It accepts that the entire universe acts as an organic whole of a divine entity who can be called as Parabrahman, who is identified as a personal god also as Narayana or Paravasudeva. The entire universe or cosmos is conceived as the body of a divine being who is called as Parabrahman in the Upanishads, who is hailed as Krishna, Vasudeva in the Puranas, Mahabharata, and other texts. So, according to the Ramanuja school of thought, the entire universe needs to be understood as a body of the infinite Brahman. In that way, it actually justifies that Brahman or God, as it can be called, is infinite in nature, and whatever there is in the universe is a part of him. The Sarvadarshana Sangraha presents another important school of theistic Vedanta, which is Purna Prajna Darshana. It is also called as Advaita Vedanta Darshana, propounded by Sri Mādhavāchārya. In this system of thought, two primary divisions have been noted: Swatantra and Aswatantra. God or the Supreme Being is the central independent force which controls the entire universe. The entire universe, as a contrast to the Ramanuja school of thought, is not held to be a body of the Brahman or Supreme Entity, but rather it is dependent upon the Supreme Brahman. It is distinct and dependent, and it is called as Paratantra. Parabrahman is identified as Lord Vishnu in this system, and the world we experience is held to be absolutely real. When Sri Madhvacharya says that the world is absolutely real, he doesn't mean that it is eternal. No philosopher would say the universe is eternal, but however, it is not sublated. It doesn't vanish when somebody realizes the Supreme Brahman. Even after the realization of the Supreme Brahman, the world remains as it is. But a person of knowledge who intuitively realizes the supremacy and independence of Brahman would know that there is no effect of the world upon him. He would realize that the entire universe is actually dependent upon the Brahman and is controlled and regulated by him. And this is the change of realization that actually occurs to the person of knowledge. And he doesn't stop seeing the world, but he develops a different perspective to see the world as dependent upon the Supreme Brahman. The system of Sri Madhvacharya propounds that bhakti or devotion towards the Lord is the actual primary aid for liberation. It is the grace of the Supreme Lord which actually fetches liberation. And to gain this grace, a person needs to be devoted to the Supreme Being, acknowledging the supremacy and independence of the Supreme Being. That is actually the definition of bhakti. Mahatmya jnana purvaka sudhrada sneha. It is not mere emotion or a sentimental outburst, but actually a deeper understanding about the independence of Brahman and thereby having a devotion to it. So hence, philosophical knowledge as well as devotion are two sides of the same coin in the system of Sri Madhvacharya. The system of Sri Madhvacharya accepts the entire Vedic corpus with allied literature as valid and accepts three proofs for pramana such as perception, inference, and verbal testimony. Sri Ramanuja schools of thought also accept these three as proofs. The system of Sri Madhvacharya acknowledges fivefold difference: the difference between God and souls, the difference between God and insentient things like the pot, the difference among the insentient things like the pot and the cloth, the difference between the sentient souls and the insentient pot, the intrinsic difference between the souls among themselves. So, in this way, fivefold difference or the Veda Panchaka is being accepted in the system of Srimadvacharya, and it is being expounded in quite detail in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha. Moving further, certain not so well known systems today, at least, are being dealt in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha. It also shows how the Sarvadarshana Sangraha covers almost all schools of thought relevant at that time. The Nakulisha Pashupada Darshana, which acknowledges the supremacy of Pashupati, identified as Shiva, and many aspects of Shaivism are being noted there. Apart from the Nakulisha Pashupata, the proper Shaiva Darshana is also being dealt here. Shiva, who is identified as Parabrahman, is being expounded in this system, and the importance of karma, maya, and other concepts are also being detailed. This apart, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha also makes note of Kashmiri side of Shaivism also, which is called as Pratyabhigna Darshana, and various philosophical concepts such as twofold nature of efficiency of objects or Artha Kriya, Dvaividya are also noted in this system. A very lesser known system called as Raseshwara Darshana is also dealt in this text. Concepts related to certain practical implementations, practical applications, and even certain traces to alchemy are also being dealt in this system. It's quite interesting to read this system from scientific point of view also. After covering these systems, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha comes to the Vaisheshika Darshana, which is a major system. Vaisheshika Darshana is dealt distinct from the Nayayika Darshana also. In the Vaisheshika Darshana, the ontological classification of elements is being expounded. Substance, dravya, guna, which are qualities, karma, action, samanya, general genus, vishesha, speciality that is residing in the atoms, samvaya, which is an inherence relation, dravya, guna, karma, samanya, vishesha, samvaya, and abhava. Of course, the abhava was added later. Nevertheless, negation was also dealt here. These have been expounded in great detail here, quoting from the primary Vaisheshika Sutras also. It clearly concentrates on ontological classification and physical elements. Many concepts about physical sciences are also being dealt here, which is very interesting for research today. It moves on to the Nayayika Darshana, which is the school of logic. The logical method is also being dealt in this text. The Nayayikas deal with inference in greater detail. How exactly a logic is to be used is also being expounded by the Nayayikas. The method of debate is also expounded in great detail in Sarvadarshana Sangraha here. How exactly an argument needs to be forwarded? How do you refute an opponent? What are the grounds of refutation, which are called as nigrasthanas? And how would we gain liberation, at least from the logician's point of view? Since he too needs to be acknowledged as a philosopher, is also dealt in this particular text. The Sarvadarshana Sangraha moves on to the Jaiminiya Darshana, also called as Purvamimamsa Darshana. An important concept called as the impersonal nature of Vedas or the Apurushayattva is being dealt in the system. The Vedas are held to be impersonal, not written by any being. Why would the Purvamimamsa scholars actually forward this theory? It is to vindicate the absolute authority of the Vedas, to vindicate the absolute validity of the Vedas and not being dependent upon any other source to justify it. The importance of performing the sacrifices as prescribed by the injunctions of the Vedas is noted here. And the philosophical concepts which actually go hand in hand and aid this particular practice, practical philosophy here, or rather even ritualistic philosophy to some extent, is dealt here. Moving further, Sarvadarshana Sangraha acknowledges that there is even philosophy in grammars also. The grammar of Panini, with its commentaries, also has a philosophical to offer. The Shabda Brahma concept and the Spota concept that is being expounded in the grammar school of grammar is also expounded in Sarvadarshana Sangraha. Sankhya Darshana, which is dealt here, is also very important from the cosmogony point of view. The creation of the universe as held by the Sankhyas is being expounded. The 24 elements of the Prakriti, Mahatattva, Ahankara Tattva, Buddhi Tattva, Manas Tattva, Pancha Gnanendriyas, Pancha Karmendriyas, Pancha Tanmatras, and Pancha Bhutas are being expounded here. The Sankhya school tries to explain how the universe is created out of the Prakriti, whether there is a Purusha or not to aid it, and how exactly the entire universe comes out as a transformation of the Mula Prakriti, which is called as Pradhana, is being expounded here. The Yoga Darshana, which actually adds a theistic side to the Sankhya school, is also dealt. The Sarvadarshana Sangraha does not neglect the practical side of the yoga system. The Ashtanga Yoga is being expounded here. The 8 limbs of the yoga, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi is being expounded here. It gives a practical guideline as to how exactly a meditation should take place, and how exactly a spiritual aspirant should actually make use of the physical body and the method of concentration to achieve this intuitive experience. This is also being dealt here. Finally, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha deals with the Shankara Darshana, the Advaita Vedanta school. Parabrahman alone is held to be absolutely real in this system. The world which we see in our daily routine is actually a superimposition on the Supreme Brahman or the Absolute Brahman. The world we experience is not of absolute reality as that of the Brahman, but however, it has a mundane reality for all practical purposes. That is not being denied. Parabrahman is held to be attributeless, being beyond any attributes, and however, however, is not void. He is not shunya. He is held to be of the nature of consciousness, Nanatmaka, and also of the nature of bliss itself, Anandatmaka. And he is of the nature of very reality or absolute reality. And Satyam Gnanam Anantam Brahma is a very famous passage that is being quoted here to vindicate it. Another important concept that is being elucidated here in the Shankara Darshana is the identity of the individual soul with the absolute Brahman. The absolute Brahman, being the nature of consciousness, is actually the individual soul who is consciousness. However, the individual soul is under an illusion that he is actually afflicted by sorrow. The moment he realizes that he is of the nature of absolute bliss, he is freed from the pangs of the world, according to the Advaita school of thought. This too is being expounded in very great detail in Sarvadarshana Sangraha. In this way, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha is a major text which needs to be read by all students and serious scholars of Indian philosophy. It gives the first-hand knowledge by quoting from actual texts which belong to those traditions of the schools. It expounds the arguments in great detail and also gives a nutshell of the ethical front of those schools. The language, diction, and the terminological vocabulary that is being used is actually indigenous to those schools. The technical terms are being very aptly used, and the arguments are presented in a very lucid way. Many a times, the author of the Sarvadarshana Sangraha reinforces the arguments by himself also. However, he doesn't get into a very pedantic style and highly refutation front also. He summarizes the whole view and makes it understandable to one and all. However, it is not too short and not too long a presentation. It is not too short to make anyone shun it of its value, and at the same time, it is not too long for any reader to shun it from the perspective of being too tedious. So, in that way, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha is a very good intermediate text and also an advanced text for anyone to understand the Indian philosophy in great detail and in a very authentic way also. Well, however, after reading the Sarvadarshana Sangraha, one has to really move on to the original text also of those particular schools and understand them in greater detail and in the primary reading of the text. There are many other versions of summarizing the Indian schools of thought, such as the Sarvadarshanam Sara Vivechanam by Sri Vijayendra Tirtha also. And in that text, the refutation part is also given. And a person who actually reads the Sarvadarshana Sangraha can actually move on to Sarva Sara Vivechanam and try to see how exactly the refutation part also appears in those schools. So, in this way, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha is a very major text and has contributed quite a lot to enrich the literature of Indian philosophy. I would like to offer my dhanyavadas and thanks to Forum for this great opportunity to speak on this text. I also am indebted to all the listeners here, the scholars, students of Indian philosophy, and serious admirers of Indian philosophy who would be hearing my lecture. I'm Siddhanta-s, and in this way, I would feel it's a very enriching experience for me also to give a summarized version of the entire text. Dhanyavada to all, and namaskaras.